Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be doing a list of 50 Victorian reads that are must-reads according to BookTube. There are many lists of like 50 classics to read before you die, things like that, and I kind of wanted to do one that was focused on Victorian literature, and more specifically things I feel like are discussed a lot on BookTube, are pretty well loved on BookTube. So this list is solely based on my experience on BookTube, so other people may feel like there's other books that should be on this list. I also do want to point out that I am limiting to 50, so there are many books that could have been on this list that I considered, but I tried to pick ones that I feel like I've heard mentioned by several different booktubers, and I tried to focus on the ones that aren't necessarily just mentioned a lot on BookTube, but are also pretty well loved. So because there are 50 of these, I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. If I've read it, I'll mention that and about how I felt about it, or I'll mention if I just haven't read it yet. Most of them I also own copies of, so I'm surrounded by books right now, so we'll just go through these. I'm actually going to group them by author, so we'll discuss authors, and then at the end I have a miscellaneous section where it's a bunch of books that are the only books on this list by that author. So let's just kick this right off, because like I said, there's 50 of these. We'll kick this off with some of the big heavy hitters, starting with the Brontes. So of course, I feel like if I were to choose a number one Victorian read that everyone should read if you're into Victober and into BookTube and Victorian readers on BookTube, is of course Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I have read this, I enjoyed it, maybe not quite as much as some people do, but I do really enjoy it and love to reread it. Next we have Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I have read both of these and absolutely adored them. They're some of my favorite books of all time. And of course from Emily we have Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and I also included her collection of poems, as I feel like as far as poetry goes for Victorian era, she is the poet that I've heard mentioned the most. Then we'll get into probably the person who has the most books on this list, which is Charles Dickens. So going quickly through these, we have Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I have read this and enjoyed it. Dombey and Son, which I have not read yet. David Copperfield, which I have read and absolutely adore. Bleak House, which I'm actually currently reading, as you can see there, and I'm really loving it so far. Little Dorrit, which I have not read yet. A Tale of Two Cities, which I also have not read yet. A Christmas Carol, which I have read and absolutely love, like most people do. And of course, Katie from Books and Things' favorite book, Our Mutual Friend, which I have not read. The next author I'm going to mention is Elizabeth Gaskell, so let's go through hers. We have Cranford, which I have read and did enjoy. North and South, which I absolutely love, definitely my favorite of hers that I've read so far. Mary Barton, which I actually am currently reading for Victober. And of course, Kate Howe's favorite, Wives and Daughters, which I have read and also really enjoy. And the one Elizabeth Gaskell I do not have that I feel like is mentioned quite a bit and pretty well enjoyed at least is The Life of Charlotte Bronte, which is a biography of Charlotte Bronte. This one I have not read, but I really do want to, and I need to get my hands on a copy. Next author is George Eliot, and I have several books by her on this list. First of all, we have Daniel Deronda, which I have not read yet, but I really hope to soon. Adam Bede, which I do really love as well. Middlemarch, of course, had to be on this list. I have not read this, but I'm actually have plans later on this year to pick it up. Romola, which I think some people may view as maybe a less popular George Eliot, which I would agree with, but I feel like it's mentioned quite a bit on BookTube. I think it's one that really stands out to me. However, it is one I have not read myself yet. And we have The Mill on the Floss, which is actually Katie from Books and Things' least favorite book of all time, but I know Kate Howe really likes it. I know a lot of other booktubers have really enjoyed it as well. Personally, again, I haven't read this one. I haven't read a ton of George Eliot. That is something I'm trying to rectify. Next, we have the beloved Thomas Hardy, and I have several books, of course, by him. First of all, I have Jude the Obscure, and this one is actually Kate Howe's least favorite book, but it is one that I was okay with. I didn't love it, but I didn't hate it quite as much as she did. But despite that, I did keep it on this list because Katie from Books and Things, this is actually her favorite Thomas Hardy novel, and I know of a lot of other people on BookTube who also really enjoy it. The Return of the Native, which I also have read. I should just mention now, I guess, that I have read all of Thomas Hardy's novels, so all of these ones I have read. This one is it's definitely in my top 5 or 6, maybe. I can't remember exactly where I put it in my ranking, but I do really enjoy it. Far From from the Madding crowd, of course, I feel like for most people this is their favorite Hardy. Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which of course is my favorite Hardy novel and one of my favorite books of all time. And that finishes off the Hardy section. So up next we have Anthony Trollope, starting with The Way We Live Now, which I have read and really enjoyed. And then I have the first three, I believe, books in the Barsetshire Chronicles. So we have The Warden and Barchester Towers, and I put both of these on this list because I feel like a lot of people suggest reading them one after the other. So I often hear them discussed together, but they are only each taking up one spot on this list. So they're taking up 2 spots altogether. I've read The Warden and I did enjoy it. And then the Barchester Towers I have not read yet, but I really hope to soon so I can continue with this series. And then, like I mentioned, the third book in the series, Dr. Thorne. And I think I put this on this list because this is probably the Anthony Trollope I hear about the most on BookTube and elsewhere. So I decided to include it in this list. Next author is Oscar Wilde, and I did for him include a couple of his plays. So first of all, we have The Importance of Being Earnest. Of course, I feel like this is the play I hear about the most as far as those that are by Oscar Wilde. And the other play I have on this list is A Woman of No Importance. I have not read either of these plays, but I've heard great things about them, would really love to get my hands on them. And of course, we can't talk about Oscar Wilde on BookTube without mentioning The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I have read. It's been a long time though, so I remember really enjoying it. And there is still a lot I remember about this book, but I am due for a reread, so that's actually part of my Victober plans this year. Now we're moving into some authors that only have a couple books on this list, starting with Robert Louis Stevenson. I have here Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, which I have read, and I enjoyed it pretty well. It wasn't necessarily a favorite for me, but I do know of a lot of other people who really, really enjoy it. And of course, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This copy I have is way longer than the actual book because it also has several other short stories involved. This is one I've read. It's been several years, but I feel like it's short enough it's easy to remember how it went, and I did like it. Next we have Wilkie Collins, and of course we have The Moonstone, which I actually read just a couple months ago and really, really liked. And The Woman in White, which is definitely my favorite of the two, and yeah, it's just a delight to read if you want something a little more thriller-esque from the Victorian era. Up next we have George Gissing, and I have first of all New Grub Street, which I feel like is mentioned quite a bit. I have not read it myself yet. And The Odd Women, which I read a few years ago for Victober, and I liked it, but not quite as much as I was hoping to. However, it has really stuck with me. Like, I think about it quite a bit. So maybe on reread someday I would up my rating a little bit, but as of right now it's kind of middling for me. That being said, I know a lot of people really love this book on BookTube. And the final author on this list before we get into the miscellaneous section is Mary Elizabeth Braddon, starting with, of course, Lady Audley's Secret. This is much loved on BookTube. This is another one that I think I gave it like 4 stars, maybe a little less than that. Didn't necessarily love it as much as a lot of other people do, but it was enjoyable. I don't regret reading it, and it's definitely one I'd be willing to reread in the future. Then I have The Doctor's Wife, also by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is definitely one that's less well known, I think, outside of BookTube, but within BookTube, I've heard a lot of people discuss this, particularly since Kate Howe, and I can't even remember who she read it with. Maybe the novel Nomad? I'm not totally sure, but they read this, they did a buddy read and really enjoyed it, and I know of a lot of other people who have kind of joined in on that and have also really liked it. Alright, on to the miscellaneous section. So these are books that are written by authors that I don't have another book by them on this list. First of all, we have The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the first short story collection within the Sherlock Holmes series, and I know of a lot of people who prefer the short stories over the novels within this series. I also almost went with The Hound of the Baskervilles for Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. However, I think that one's kind of borderline, maybe not quite Victorian. It might be just outside of it, so I decided to go for this because I do feel like I hear a lot of love for it. Frankly, probably more than even The Hound of the Baskervilles, so this one just felt right. I have not read it myself, but it is the next on my list for the Sherlock Holmes series. Then we have Vanity Fair by William Thackeray. This is one I have read actually earlier this year, and while at the time I really enjoyed it, but I kind of thought it was slightly below a 5 stars for me. Since then, I've thought about it a lot, and I think on further reflection, it actually is a 5-star for me. I really, really enjoy this one. Then we have The Half-Sisters by Geraldine Dewsbury. This is definitely one that I think a lot of people really enjoy, particularly on BookTube. I hear this is the only place I've ever even heard of it, but I know of a lot of channels, a lot of individuals who have read this and really liked it, even though it's out of print right now. And I personally have read it as well and also really enjoy it. Next, we have Dracula by Bram Stoker. I have not read this yet, but I hope to this Victober. And Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. This one I have not read yet, but I really would like to. I mean, obviously everything on this list that I have not read yet, I want to. Next, we have Deerbrook by Harriet Martineau. This is definitely one I've heard a lot of praise for on BookTube and is one I really desperately want to get my hands on because I have not read it yet. But like I said, I've just heard great things about it. Then we have East Lynne, which is by Ellen Wood, or Mrs. Henry Wood as she is referred to on some copies of this. I have not read this one either, but it's one that's been on my wish list for a very long time. And the very last one, just because it happened to be there, is The Romance of a Shop by Amy Levy. Another one that outside of BookTube I would never probably have heard of, but I've heard several BookTubers talk about it and say they really enjoyed it, and it's been enough that I decided to put it on this list. So that is it. Those are 50 Victorian reads you must read before you die. Thank you to all of my fellow BookTubers who have continued to inspire me when it comes to Victorian literature, introduce me to new books. Let me know down below what you thought of this list, if there's books you don't think should have been on here, if you feel like there were other books that you would have liked to see on here. Obviously, like I said, had to limit to 50, and it's based solely on my experience on BookTube, so everybody has a different set of channels they watch, and you may have heard of some a little bit more than I have, and some of these maybe you've never really heard of or haven't heard too much about. So thank you again for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful Victober, and I will see you next time.